And so, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to do now is do 2 or 3 things because of the limitation of time. The first thing I'm going to do is talk to you about some middle ground that the Christians have with the humanistic worldview. And by the way, humanism is not monolithic. There are at least 6 or 7 types of humanistic systems that you can think of, from Marx and Feuerbach on the one side to Ayn Rand on the other, and you can go right down to situation ethics. And all of these, we think humanism is monolithic. It is not. The egocentric humanism of Ayn Rand is very different to the ethics of and the humanism of Marx and the Mao-Lenin doctrine and so on. But there are 1 or 2 things most of humanity has come to terms with as legitimate categories which are actually worth interacting on and discussing, unless you're a little bit like Richard Dawkins, who ultimately dismisses the category of evil. But at least one can say honestly, he has probably wrestled with it and thought about it. So the first thing I want to say to you is the reality and the mystery of evil. Here we have a category that Christians elaborate upon and humanists actually hint at or struggle with. When Ronald Reagan called the former Soviet Union an evil empire, you'd think that he'd sort of broken a different kind of wall of international geopolitical communication. But that's exactly what he said. And when he said Mr. Gorbachev pulled down that wall, he saw the oppressiveness of that ideology as being so evil, and that wall had to come down. But here's what I say to you. Psychiatrists wrestle with this. What does the term really mean? Some years ago, Benedict Carey wrote an article called in the New York Times, "For the worst of us, the diagnosis may be, in quotes, evil. Predatory killers often do far more than commit murder. Some have lured their victims into homemade chambers for prolonged torture. Others have exotic tastes for vivisection, sexual humiliation, and burning. Many perform their grisly rituals as much for pleasure as for any other reason. Among themselves, a few forensic scientists have taken to thinking of these people as not merely disturbed, but evil. Evil in that their deliberate, habitual savagery defies any psychological explanation or attempt at treatment. Most psychiatrists assiduously avoid the word evil, contending that its use would precipitate a dangerous slide from clinical to moral judgment." Isn't it interesting? That line itself is a moral judgment. That they don't want to slide into making moral judgments that could put people on death row unnecessarily and obscure the understanding of violent criminals. And why would that be wrong? Because you dare not execute somebody unjustly, which is moral reasoning. See, it's woven into the fabric of why they don't even want to talk about it, but assume it all along. And then he goes on to say, many career forensic examiners say their work forces them to reflect on the concept of evil, and some acknowledge they can find no other term for certain individuals they have evaluate. And then they form a kind of a hierarchy of how to arrive at the word evil. We are talking about people, says one psychiatrist, who commit breathtaking acts, who do so repeatedly, who know what they're doing and are doing it in peacetime under no threat to themselves, said Dr. Michael Stone, the Columbia psychiatrist, who has examined several hundred killers at various centers where he consults and teaches. We know from experience who these people are and how they behave, and it is time to give their behavior the proper appellation. See, for some acts, evil is the only description. We were recently at a prison, one of the deadliest places in America to be years ago, but so much has changed there. 85% of them are on life without parole. A couple of my colleagues who were here, Vince was there with me, Sanj, and we were walking past death row. It's a very sobering place to be. And we never asked why they were on death row. We just, through the bars, put our hands, shook hands with them, prayed with them. And I tell you, just hearing them talk about the need for prayer and listening, one voice bellowing from 3 cells down, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." We walked out of there, and then I learned the first guy with whom I held both hands and prayed, what he had done to get onto death row. If I described it to you, you would actually think I'm exploiting your emotions and straining you to a point of horror. But that's the way it was. And so what they're saying is, yes, there are some preconditions for some. There are some issues in which these things can happen. But for some, the description is fitting to say evil. And when you go back to the case of Eichmann, Rudolf Hess, in his journal, talks about when they made the decision to start gassing people. "I was not properly conscious of the first gassing of human beings," Rudolf Hess says. "Perhaps the procedure as a whole made too much of an impression on me. I remember much better the gassing of 900 Russians soon afterwards in the old crematorium using Block 11 would have caused too much trouble. While they were still being unloaded, several holes were simply knocked through the earth and cement ceiling of the morgue. The Russians had to undress in the outer room, and they all went quite calmly into the morgue, since they'd been told they were going to be deloused there. The whole transport walked right into the morgue. The door was locked and the gas poured in through the openings. How long the killing took, I do not know. The hum could still be heard for quite a while, however. When it was thrown in, some people cried, 'Gas!' and a great roaring began and a rush to both doors. They withstood the pressure, however. After several hours, the room was opened and aired out. Then I saw the gassed corpses en masse for the first time. But I must be frank, this gassing had a calming effect on me, since the mass extermination of the Jews was about to begin, and neither Eichmann nor myself knew what method of killing might be used on the expected masses. Now we had discovered the gas and the procedure as well." Educated people. I've been to that very room. You see, there is no other description. But this is where the Christian begins to depart from merely the appellation evil. The Christian moves into the first very narrative when Cain was told, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door." May as well say evil. Sin is crouching at the door. It desires to have you. Sin is a choice that you make. Evil becomes the result that then overtakes and overwhelms you. The mere seeking of the destruction of somebody else goes beyond just sin. It becomes actually evil. And when you think of what happened in Rwanda with the hundreds of thousands, and one of the world leaders flew in by plane and told them to keep the engines running because he wasn't going to stay long. He walked in there, saw the horror, and walked out of there saying, "I didn't know this was what was happening." The Canadian general heading up the NATO forces said this, "You didn't know? I've spent my life in NATO. I know NATO planes were overhead and knew. I'm haunted by dreams by the eyes of thousands and thousands of Africans, disembodied, staring out of the African darkness. You can't just walk away from something like that saying you did what you could. You can't just Pontius Pilate 800,000 people." But here it is, what David Hume said in his dialogues concerning natural religion. My colleague Os Guinness points all of this out. Man is the greatest enemy of man. Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Émile, "Seek the author of evil no longer, it is yourself." Voltaire, after the Lisbon earthquake, writing to a Protestant pastor, "I pity Portuguese people like you, but men still do more harm to each other on their little molehill than nature does to them. Our wars massacre more men than are swallowed up by earthquakes." You see, you can't just keep it at an abstract notion of evil. It has to come down to the human heart. So the logical connection for the Christian we get our values from the nature of what evil really is. It is engineered by the will and the whim of man. Can you really talk about evil? That's the question I have, without assuming an absolute moral framework. And can you really talk about education without first looking inside the human heart? Do you hear what I raised as a question? Can you really talk about evil without assuming an absolute moral framework? And can you talk of education without first looking inside the human heart? So for us, and from my worldview as a Christian, I look at the preponderance and the reality of evil, and I say that while the world is now agreeing that evil is a category, the Christian has a way of pointing why evil actually comes about. That's where humanists will never go. They don't like to take the logical outworking of a category and place it with human responsibility and the nature of what humanity is all about. So from my point of view, as Norman Geisler used to say humorously, the problem wasn't the apple on the tree, it was the pear on the ground. It's really not as just one little thing after another and taking the fruit of the tree. That is a simplistic way of explaining it away.